The black Mercedes pulled up outside the Westbrook Conservatory of Music exactly at 9 in the morning. Victoria Sterling stepped out, her Italian heels clicking against the pavement with practiced confidence. She didn't wait for the driver to open her door. She never did. At 32 years old, she had performed at Carnegie Hall 3 times, played with the London Symphony Orchestra, and her last album had topped the classical music charts for 6 consecutive weeks. Time magazine had called her the Mozart of our generation, though she privately thought that comparison was generous to Mozart. The conservatory building stood before her, all glass and marble, reflecting the autumn sunlight. She'd been here before, of course, but always as a guest performer. This time was different. This time she was here to teach a masterclass series. The dean had practically begged her to come, offering an amount of money that she didn't need but accepted anyway. Money was just another way of keeping score, and Victoria always kept score. Inside, the hallways smelled like old wood and expensive instruments. Students hurried past with violin cases and sheet music tucked under their arms. A few of them recognized her and whispered to each other, their eyes wide. Victoria didn't acknowledge them. She had learned early in her career that mystique mattered almost as much as talent. Let them wonder. Let them whisper. Her assigned practice room was on the 3rd floor, but she wanted to see the main concert hall first. After all, that's where the real magic happened. That's where she would stand in front of 200 eager students and show them what true excellence looked like. The door to the concert hall was heavy, made of mahogany that must have been 100 years old. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The hall was empty, or so she thought. The Steinway grand piano sat center stage under a soft spotlight, black and gleaming like a sleeping giant. The seats stretched out in neat rows, red velvet cushions waiting for audiences that would hang on every note. Victoria smiled to herself. This was her world. This was where she belonged. Then she heard it. A note, then another. Someone was playing the piano. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As she got closer to the stage, she could see a figure sitting at the piano. Not a student. Not a professor. A man in a gray uniform with a yellow cleaning cart parked nearby. A janitor. His hands moved across the keys slowly, carefully, like he was afraid they might break. The melody he played was simple, something a first-year student might attempt. But even that simple melody was riddled with mistakes. Wrong notes, hesitations. His fingers stumbled over passages that any trained pianist could play in their sleep. Victoria stopped halfway down the aisle and crossed her arms. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. This man, this janitor, was sitting at a concert grand piano worth more than most people's houses, butchering a simple piece like a child at their first lesson. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the acoustics of the hall. The man's hands froze above the keys. He turned slowly, and Victoria could see his face now. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with gray hair and tired eyes. His uniform was clean but worn at the edges. His hands, she noticed, looked rough and weathered, the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime doing manual labor. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, already standing up from the bench. "I didn't think anyone would be here this early." "Clearly," Victoria said, walking closer to the stage. "Do you make a habit of playing instruments that don't belong to you?" The man looked down at his feet. I was finishing cleaning the hall and I saw the piano and..." He trailed off as if realizing how weak his explanation sounded. "And you thought you'd help yourself?" Victoria climbed the steps to the stage, her heels clicking loudly in the quiet hall. Up close she could see the name tag on his uniform. "Thomas, I'm sorry," he repeated. "I'll go." "Wait," Victoria said, and there was something in her tone that made him pause. She walked over to the piano bench and ran her hand along the edge of the Steinway. "What were you trying to play?" Thomas hesitated. Just something I heard once, a long time ago." "It showed," Victoria said with a slight laugh. "Look, Thomas, I'm sure you're very good at your job. Mopping floors, cleaning windows, whatever it is you do here. But this?" She gestured at the piano. "This requires years of training, decades of practice. You can't just sit down and expect to play because you heard something once." The older man nodded slowly. "You're right. I shouldn't have presumed. Real musicianship," Victoria continued, warming to her subject now, "isn't about fumbling around on a piano during your break. It's about discipline, sacrifice, natural talent, yes, but also endless hours of work that most people can't even imagine. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, ma'am. Good. Victoria smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. So maybe stick to what you know. Leave the music to those of us who've actually earned the right to play. Thomas gathered his cleaning supplies without another word. He pushed his cart toward the side exit, the wheels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Victoria watched him go, already dismissing him from her mind. She sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it to the perfect height. Her fingers touched the keys and she began to play a complex Bach fugue, each note crystal clear and precisely timed. This was how it was supposed to sound. This was what real talent looked like. She didn't see Thomas pause at the doorway. She didn't see the way his shoulders sagged just a little, or the way his hand lingered on the door handle before he pushed through. She was already lost in the music and her own brilliance, in the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, and everyone else was exactly where they belonged too. The next few hours passed in a blur of meetings with the dean, reviewing the schedule for her masterclass series and meeting some of the faculty. Everyone treated her with deference, with respect, with the kind of careful attention people reserve for celebrities and visiting dignitaries. Victoria accepted it all as her due. This was the life she'd built, note by note, performance by performance. At lunch, she sat with 3 of her advanced students in the conservatory's cafe. They asked her questions about her technique, her practice routine, her upcoming performances in Vienna. She answered with the casual confidence of someone who'd given these answers 1,000 times before. That's when Thomas walked past, pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. One of her students started to say something to him, maybe a greeting, but Victoria spoke first. "That's the janitor I told you about," she said, not quite whispering but not quite speaking at full voice either. "Caught him this morning trying to play the Steinway. It was painful to listen to." Her students laughed, uncomfortable but eager to please. Thomas heard. She knew he heard because his step faltered just slightly before he continued on his way. Victoria took a sip of her coffee, feeling satisfied. Everyone should know their place in the world. She'd learned that lesson early, and it had served her well. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know in that moment, was that Thomas knew his place better than she ever would. And in the coming weeks, that certainty she felt, that absolute conviction that talent and training were all that mattered, would crumble like sheet music left too long in the rain. 3 weeks had passed since that first morning in the concert hall, and Victoria had settled into a comfortable routine at the conservatory. Her master classes were the talk of the campus. Students would crowd into the observation room, fighting for seats just to watch her work with the advanced performers. She was demanding, sometimes brutally honest, but no one could deny that she knew what she was talking about. When Victoria Sterling told you that your interpretation lacked depth or your technique needed work, you listened. But the students also learned something else about her during those 3 weeks. They learned that her sharp tongue didn't reserve itself just for musical criticism. Every few days, Victoria would spot Thomas somewhere in the building. In the hallway with his mop and bucket. In the practice rooms emptying trash cans. Once she saw him replacing light bulbs in one of the lecture halls. And every time she saw him, if her students were nearby, she made sure they noticed too. It started small. A raised eyebrow when he walked past. A slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then it became comments, always delivered in that same tone she used when discussing a flawed performance. Casual, almost friendly, but with an edge underneath. "There's our aspiring pianist," she'd said one afternoon when Thomas was cleaning the windows in the main corridor. Her students had giggled nervously. Thomas had kept cleaning, his back to them, his movements steady and practiced. Another time, in the faculty lounge, she'd mentioned him while discussing discipline with her students. "You know what separates a professional musician from someone who just likes music? Understanding your limitations. Knowing when you're out of your depth. Some people never learn that lesson." Her students would laugh, but it was never quite comfortable laughter. They laughed because Victoria was Victoria Sterling. And you didn't disagree with someone like that. You didn't question someone who'd achieved everything they'd only dreamed about, but some of them felt uneasy about it even if they couldn't quite say why. Thomas never responded. He never defended himself or tried to explain. He just did his job, moving through the conservatory like a ghost, present but somehow invisible to most people. Only Victoria seemed determined to keep noticing him, to keep reminding everyone of that morning when he'd dared to touch the Steinway Grand. The weeks went by, and Victoria prepared for her upcoming solo performance. The conservatory had arranged for her to give a special concert at the end of her residency, a thank you for her time teaching their students. She'd chosen a demanding program, Liszt, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, pieces that would showcase not just her technical ability, but her range as an artist. The concert was already sold out, tickets gone within hours of going on sale. She practiced every day, usually from noon until 5, then again from 7 until 9. She had the main concert hall reserved for her practice sessions, and no one was allowed to disturb her during those hours. The conservatory had made that very clear to everyone on staff. But one evening, Victoria's agent called with news about a contract dispute in Vienna. They talked for over an hour, working through details and negotiating terms. By the time she hung up, it was well past midnight. She'd missed her entire evening practice session, and the concert was only 2 weeks away. Frustrated and anxious, she grabbed her bag and headed toward the conservatory. She had a key that gave her access to the building 24 hours a day. One of the perks of being Victoria Sterling. The streets were empty, and the conservatory parking lot had only 2 cars, probably belonging to security guards. Inside, the building felt different at night. The hallways that bustled with energy during the day were silent now, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows on the walls. Her footsteps echoed as she walked toward the concert hall. She'd practice for a few hours, work out her frustration on the keys, and feel better about losing the evening session. But as she approached the concert hall, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. Music. Someone was playing the piano. Her first reaction was anger. This was her practice time, her space. Who would dare use the concert hall at midnight? Then she realized it couldn't be her practice time, because she'd never booked anything this late. Still, the irritation remained. She'd come here to practice, and now someone else was using the piano. She walked closer to the heavy doors, ready to knock and ask whoever it was to wrap up quickly. But then she recognized the piece they were playing. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire classical repertoire, a piece that took years to master that could break even experienced pianists. Victoria paused with her hand on the door. The playing was strange. There were mistakes, obvious ones. Notes that didn't quite land cleanly. Passages where the tempo wavered. The technical execution was flawed in ways that would make any music professor wince. But there was something else. Something that made her hand fall away from the door handle. Something that made her move to the small window instead, pressing her face close to the glass to see inside. The emotion pouring out of that piano was unlike anything she'd heard in years, maybe ever. Every note, even the wrong ones, carried weight. Carried meaning. The music wasn't just being played. It was being felt, lived, breathed into existence by someone who understood what those notes were really saying. Through the window, she could see the pianist, her breath caught in her throat. It was Thomas. He sat at the Steinway Grand, his eyes closed, his whole body moving with the music. His weathered hands moved across the keys with a familiarity that spoke of years, decades even, of practice. Yes, there were mistakes. Yes, his technique had limitations. But the way he played, the way he poured himself into every phrase, was something Victoria had spent her entire career trying to achieve and never quite reaching. She stood frozen at that window, watching him play. The second movement began, the beautiful, haunting melody that had made grown men cry in concert halls around the world. Thomas played it with such tenderness, such deep understanding of loss and longing, that Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. This wasn't some janitor fumbling at a piano during his break. This was a musician, a real one, someone who understood music in a way that had nothing to do with perfect technique or flawless execution, someone who knew what it meant to feel every single note. The piece went on and Victoria couldn't move. She watched Thomas's face, saw the way his expression changed with the music, pain, joy, sorrow, hope, all flowing through him and into the piano. His hands might have been arthritic and worn from years of physical labor, but they still remembered. They still knew. When he finally finished, the last notes fading into the silence of the empty hall, Thomas sat there for a long moment with his hands resting on the keys. Then he opened his eyes and looked down at his fingers like he was surprised to find them there, like he'd been somewhere else entirely and was only just coming back. Victoria stepped away from the window before he could see her. Her heart was pounding, though she couldn't quite understand why. She walked quickly back down the hallway, her earlier desire to practice completely forgotten. Her mind raced with questions that she couldn't answer. Who was this man? Where had he learned to play like that? And why was he working as a janitor in a music conservatory instead of performing on stages around the world? But deeper than those questions was another feeling, one that Victoria didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't quite push away. For the first time in her life, standing in that dark hallway listening to an old man with arthritic hands play an imperfect but deeply moving performance, Victoria Sterling felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt small, not because his technique was better than hers. It wasn't. Not because he could play things he couldn't, but because in those few minutes listening through a door at midnight, she'd heard something in his playing that was completely absent from her own soul. She went home that night without practicing. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to stop hearing that music in her head. And for the first time since she was a child, Victoria wondered if maybe, just maybe, she didn't know everything about music after all. Victoria couldn't stop thinking about that night. 3 days had passed and the memory of Thomas playing Rachmaninoff kept replaying in her mind like a song stuck on repeat. She'd tried to focus on her practice, on her upcoming performance, but something had shifted inside her. Every time she sat at the piano now, she heard the difference between her playing and his. Hers was perfect. His was flawed. But his had something hers didn't, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She found herself watching Thomas differently now. When she saw him in the hallways, she didn't make snide comments anymore. Instead, she studied him, the way he moved through the building with quiet efficiency, the way other staff members greeted him warmly, like he was part of the furniture, familiar and reliable. The way students would sometimes stop to chat with him, and he'd listen with genuine interest, asking about their recitals or their struggles with particular pieces. Who was this man? Victoria wasn't used to not knowing things. She was used to being the expert, the authority, the one with all the answers. But Thomas was a puzzle she couldn't solve, and it was driving her crazy. On the 4th day after that midnight encounter, Victoria did something she'd never done before in her entire career. She asked for help. The dean's office was on the 2nd floor, all dark wood and leather chairs that smelled like old books. But Victoria didn't want to talk to the dean. She wanted to talk to his assistant, an older woman named Margaret who'd worked at the conservatory for what seemed like forever. Margaret was the kind of person who knew everything about everyone, who'd seen generations of students come and go, who remembered when the building still had actual chalkboards instead of smart screens. Victoria found her in the small office adjacent to the dean's, surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of papers that probably should have been digitized years ago. Margaret looked up from her computer, surprised to see Victoria Sterling standing in her doorway. "Ms. Sterling," Margaret said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Is everything all right? Do you need something for your master class?" "Actually," Victoria said, and she hated how uncertain her voice sounded, "I wanted to ask you about someone who works here. One of the maintenance staff." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh," Thomas, Victoria said. "The janitor. I was just curious about his background. How long he's worked here." Something changed in Margaret's expression. Her professional smile faded into something softer, sadder. "Thomas Brennan," she said quietly. "Why do you ask?" Victoria shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just curious. I've seen him around and he seems, I don't know, different." Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying Victoria's face like she was trying to decide something. Then she sighed and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down," she said. "If you really want to know about Thomas, I'll tell you. But it's not a short story." Victoria sat, her hands folded in her lap, feeling strangely like a student called to the principal's office. "Thomas wasn't always a janitor," Margaret began. 40 years ago, he was a student here. One of the most talented students this conservatory has ever seen." Victoria's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. "He came from nothing," Margaret continued. "Grew up in the poorest part of the city. His mother cleaned houses, and his father worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. But Thomas had this gift. He taught himself to play on an old keyboard someone threw out. And by the time he was 15, he was good enough to audition here. We gave him a full scholarship. We don't do that often, but with Thomas it wasn't even a question." Margaret pulled off her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her cardigan. And Victoria noticed her hands were shaking slightly. He was brilliant, Margaret said. Not just technically skilled, but he had something special. When he played, you felt it. Really felt it. Everyone said he was going to be the next great concert pianist. He won competitions, got offers to study in Europe, had agents calling him before he even graduated. What happened? Victoria asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Life happened, Margaret said simply. In his final year here, he married his girlfriend, a sweet girl named Helen who worked at the library. They were so young, so in love, so sure that everything would work out. And then Helen got sick. Victoria felt her chest tighten. Cancer, Margaret continued. Aggressive and expensive. This was before the healthcare reforms, back when medical bills could destroy a family overnight. Thomas had a choice. He could pursue his career, let Helen fight alone, maybe lose her while he was traveling for performances. Or he could stay. He stayed, Victoria whispered. He stayed, Margaret confirmed. He took a job here as a janitor because it offered health benefits and steady pay. He worked double shifts, took every extra hour he could get. Helen fought for 3 years before she passed. By then they had 2 little girls and Thomas was the only parent they had left. Victoria closed her eyes, trying to process this information. He raised those girls alone, Margaret said. And there was pride in her voice now. Never complained, never asked for help, just worked his job and made sure his daughters had everything they needed. He put them both through college. One's a doctor now, the other's a teacher. Good kids, they visit him sometimes, do they know? Victoria asked. About what he gave up? Margaret shook her head. He never told them. He didn't want them to feel guilty. Didn't want them to think they'd stolen his dreams. As far as they know, their father was always a janitor who happened to love music. Victoria sat in silence, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under her. All those comments she'd made. All those times she'd mocked him in front of her students. All that casual cruelty delivered with a smile. Why does he still play? She finally asked. I heard him one night late in the concert hall. Margaret smiled sadly. Because music is who he is. It's not something he does, it's something he is. His hands don't work like they used to. Arthritis from years of manual labor. But late at night, when he thinks everyone's gone home, he sits at that piano and remembers who he was, who he could have been. It's the only time he allows himself that. Victoria felt something hot and shameful burning in her throat. I didn't know, she said, and her voice cracked slightly. Most people don't, Margaret said gently. Thomas doesn't talk about his past. He's not bitter about it. He made his choice and he lives with it. But Miss Sterling, can I tell you something? Victoria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. In 40 years of working here, I've seen hundreds of talented musicians come through these doors. Prodigies, competition winners, students who went on to play with major orchestras. But I've never seen anyone who understood music the way Thomas did, the way he still does even now. Because for him, music was never about fame or success or proving he was better than everyone else. It was about expressing something he couldn't put into words. It was about touching people's souls. Margaret put her glasses back on and looked at Victoria with eyes that seemed to see right through her. That's the difference between a good musician and a great one. Technical skill is important, yes, but without heart, without purpose, without understanding what the music is really about, it's just noise. Pretty noise, maybe. Perfect noise. But still just noise. Victoria stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak. Thank you, she managed to say. Thank you for telling me. She walked out of Margaret's office in a daze. The hallways of the conservatory looked different now, like she was seeing them for the first time. She thought about all her performances, all her accolades, all her perfect reviews. She thought about the way audiences applauded politely, appreciatively, but never with tears in their eyes. She thought about how she'd spent her entire life perfecting her technique and zero time asking herself why any of it mattered. That evening, she sat in her practice room with her hands on the keys, and for the first time in 20 years, Victoria Sterling didn't know how to play the piano. Not really. She knew how to execute notes perfectly. She knew how to play without mistakes. But she didn't know how to make someone feel something. She didn't know how to pour her soul into the music the way Thomas did with his broken, arthritic hands. And sitting there alone in that practice room, surrounded by everything she'd achieved and everything she'd proven, Victoria did something else she hadn't done in years. She cried. The next week passed in a blur that Victoria could barely make sense of. She went through the motions of her master classes, correcting her students' posture and pointing out technical errors. But her heart wasn't in it anymore. The students noticed. One of them even asked if she was feeling all right, and Victoria had just nodded and changed the subject. Her upcoming performance was only 5 days away now, and she should have been focused, should have been practicing 8 hours a day like she usually did before a major concert. Instead, she found herself distracted, restless, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had broken inside her. She practiced, of course. She ran through Liszt's transcendental etudes until her fingers ached. She worked on the Chopin nocturnes until she could play them in her sleep. But every time she played, she heard the difference between what she was doing and what Thomas had done that night. Her playing was flawless. His had been imperfect, but his had meant something. She started staying late at the conservatory, hoping to hear him play again. She'd wait in the empty hallways, pretending to work in her practice room while listening for the sound of the piano from the concert hall. But he never came. Maybe he'd sensed someone listening that night. Maybe he only played when he was absolutely certain he was alone. On the Tuesday before her performance, Victoria made a decision. She couldn't keep avoiding this. She needed to talk to Thomas to understand, to somehow make sense of what was happening to her. But she didn't know how to start that conversation. How do you apologize to someone you've spent weeks humiliating? How do you tell them that they've completely unraveled everything you thought you knew about yourself? She found him on Wednesday afternoon, cleaning one of the small practice rooms on the 4th floor. The door was open and she could see him inside, wiping down the windows with careful, methodical movements. Her hands were shaking as she knocked on the door frame. Thomas turned, surprised to see her. "Ms. Sterling," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, no resentment. Just that same quiet courtesy he showed everyone. "Do you need this room? I can come back later." "No," Victoria said quickly. "I wanted to talk to you, if you have a minute." Something flickered across Thomas's face, confusion maybe, but he nodded and set down his cleaning cloth. "Of course." Victoria stepped into the small room and closed the door behind her. Suddenly, the space felt very cramped, very intimate. She could smell the cleaning solution and see the afternoon sun streaming through the now spotless windows. "I heard you play," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "A week ago. Late at night in the concert hall. I heard you play Rachmaninoff." Thomas went very still. The color seemed to drain from his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know I shouldn't. Sometimes I can't help myself. It won't happen again." "No," Victoria said, and she was surprised by the urgency in her own voice. "That's not what I meant. Thomas, I talked to Margaret. She told me about your past. About everything." Thomas looked down at his weathered hands, and Victoria saw them tremble slightly. "Margaret talks too much sometimes," he said, but there was no real criticism in his tone. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, and the words felt inadequate, too small for what she needed to express. "I'm so sorry for the way I treated you, the things I said, the way I acted. I didn't know." "You don't need to apologize," Thomas said, looking up at her now. "You were right about some of it. My technique isn't what it used to be. My hands don't work the way they should. I'm not a real pianist anymore, just someone who remembers being one." "That's not true," Victoria said, and she was shocked by how passionate her voice sounded. "What you played that night, it was more real than anything I've ever played in my entire career. It had soul. It had meaning. It had everything that my playing doesn't have." Thomas studied her face for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't know how to do what you do," Victoria said, and she felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I've spent my whole life perfecting my technique. I can play anything, any piece ever written, and I can play it without mistakes. But I don't know how to make people feel something. I don't know how to put my heart into the music. And watching you, hearing you play with all those imperfections but with so much emotion, it made me realize that I've been doing this all wrong." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "You haven't been doing it wrong, Victoria. You've built an incredible career. You've achieved things most musicians only dream about." "But what's the point?" Victoria asked, and now the tears were falling freely. "What's the point of technical perfection if it doesn't touch anyone? If it doesn't mean anything?" Thomas moved to the piano bench in the corner of the practice room and sat down slowly, like his joints hurt. He gestured for Victoria to sit beside him, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. "Can I tell you something?" Thomas asked. When I was young, when I was studying here, I used to think the same way you do. I thought music was about being the best, about proving I was more talented than everyone else. I practiced until my fingers bled because I wanted to be perfect. He looked at his hands again, turning them over to show the calluses and scars from decades of manual labor. And then Helen got sick, and suddenly music didn't seem so important anymore. There were more important things than being perfect, like making sure the woman you love doesn't die alone, like raising your children and making sure they have better opportunities than you did. But you still played, Victoria said softly. I still played, Thomas agreed, but I played differently. When I sit at that piano now, late at night when no one's watching, I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm just trying to express what's in my heart. All the love I had for Helen, all the pride I have in my daughters, all the dreams I set aside and the peace I made with that choice. Every note I play carries a piece of my life, my experiences, my emotions. He turned to look at Victoria directly. That's what you're missing. Not technique. Not skill, but purpose. You need to ask yourself why you're playing. What are you trying to say with your music? Who are you trying to reach? Victoria sat in silence, letting his words sink in. She thought about her upcoming performance, about the program she'd chosen. All difficult pieces, all designed to showcase her technical ability. But what was she really trying to say with them? What did she want her audience to feel? I don't know, she admitted finally. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I don't know if I've ever known. Thomas smiled, and it was a kind smile, understanding. Then maybe that's where you need to start. Not with the notes, but with the meaning behind them. What matters to you? What do you want people to understand about you, about life, about the human experience? Once you figure that out, the rest will follow. Will you help me? Victoria asked, and she was surprised by how vulnerable she sounded. I know I have no right to ask after the way I treated you. But my performance is in 4 days, and I don't want to just play notes anymore. I want to play music. Real music. The way you do. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria held her breath, waiting for him to refuse, to tell her she didn't deserve his help. But instead he nodded slowly. All right, he said, but we can't work on technique. I can't help you with that. What I can help you with is finding your voice, finding what you want to say. How? Victoria asked. Thomas stood up and walked to the piano in the practice room. Tell me about your life, he said. Not your career, your life. What makes you happy? What breaks your heart? What do you dream about when you're not thinking about music? Victoria opened her mouth to answer and then stopped. She realized with a sinking feeling that she didn't have an answer. Her entire life had been about music, about success, about achievement. She couldn't remember the last time she'd thought about anything else. I don't know, she whispered. Then that's the problem, Thomas said gently. You can't express something through music if you don't have anything to express. You've been so focused on being perfect that you forgot to live, and music without life behind it is just empty sound. He sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. Listen, he said. I'm going to play something simple, just a few measures, but I want you to hear what I'm saying with it. His hands moved across the keys and a simple melody emerged. It wasn't complex, wasn't difficult, but it carried weight. In those few measures, Victoria could hear everything Thomas had told her. Loss, love, acceptance, peace. The music told a story without words. When he finished, he looked at her. That's what music is supposed to do. It's supposed to communicate what words can't. But you have to have something to communicate first. You have to have lived, felt, experienced things deeply enough that they need to come out through your playing. Victoria nodded, understanding dawning on her like sunrise. I have 4 days, she said. Can I learn this in 4 days? Thomas smiled. You can't learn it at all. You can only discover it. But yes, we can start. Come here every evening after your classes. We'll work together. I'll show you how to stop thinking about the notes and start thinking about the meaning. Thank you, Victoria said, and she meant it more deeply than she'd ever meant any words in her life. Don't thank me yet, Thomas said with a slight laugh. This is going to be harder than any technical exercise you've ever done. Because you're not just learning to play differently, you're learning to be different. Victoria stood up, feeling like something heavy had lifted off her shoulders. I'm ready, she said, and for the first time in weeks she meant it. The next 3 evenings changed everything Victoria thought she knew about music. She met with Thomas after her master classes, and they worked together in that small practice room on the fourth floor, but they didn't work on scales or arpeggios or any of the technical exercises she'd spent her life perfecting. Instead, they talked. Thomas asked her questions no one had ever asked before. What was her earliest memory? What did she regret? If she could tell the world one thing, what would it be? At first, Victoria struggled to answer. She'd spent so long building walls around herself, presenting only the image of the perfect, successful pianist, that she'd forgotten who she really was underneath all that. But slowly, piece by piece, she started to remember. She told Thomas about her childhood, about a father who'd pushed her relentlessly toward excellence but never once told her he was proud. She told him about the loneliness of touring, about hotel rooms in cities whose names she could barely remember. She told him about the hollow feeling she got after standing ovations, how she'd smile and bow while feeling absolutely nothing inside. And Thomas listened. Really listened. Then he'd sit at the piano and show her how to take those feelings and channel them into the music. Don't think about the notes, he'd say. Think about what you want to say. Let your hands find the notes that express it. It was the hardest thing Victoria had ever done, harder than any virtuoso piece she'd ever learned, because it required her to be vulnerable, to be honest, to stop hiding behind perfection and actually feel something. The night before her performance, Victoria barely slept. She lay in bed thinking about the program she'd planned months ago, all those technically demanding pieces chosen to impress. It didn't feel right anymore. None of it felt right. At 3 a.m, she made a decision that would have seemed insane to her just weeks earlier. She was going to change everything. The concert hall filled quickly on Saturday evening. All 200 seats sold out, people eager to hear Victoria Sterling perform. Critics from major publications sat in the front rows, notebooks ready. Her students clustered together in the middle section, excited to see their teacher on stage. And there in the very front row sat Thomas in his one good suit, looking uncomfortable but present because Victoria had personally asked him to come. Backstage, Victoria's hand shook as she prepared to go on, not from nervousness about the technical demands of her program, but from what she was about to do instead. The stage manager gave her the signal and she walked out to thunderous applause. The spotlight was warm on her face as she took her place at the Steinway Grand, the same piano where she'd first mocked Thomas all those weeks ago. The same piano where he'd shown her what music could really mean. She sat at the bench and adjusted it slightly. Then instead of beginning to play, she stood back up and walked to the front of the stage. The audience quieted, confused. This wasn't part of the program. "Good evening," Victoria said, and her voice carried clearly through the hall. "I know you all came here expecting a certain program tonight. Liszt, Chopin, Rachmaninoff. Music designed to showcase technical brilliance. And a few weeks ago, that's exactly what I would have given you." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "But something happened recently that changed my understanding of what music is supposed to be. Someone taught me that technical perfection without emotional truth is just noise. Beautiful noise, perhaps, but ultimately meaningless." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Victoria could see her students leaning forward, curious. The critics raised their eyebrows, probably already composing their reviews about how she'd lost her edge. "That someone is here tonight," Victoria continued. "His name is Thomas Brennan. Most of you probably don't know him. He works here at the conservatory as a janitor. But 40 years ago, he was one of the most talented students this school had ever seen." She looked directly at Thomas, who had gone very pale. Thomas gave up his dreams of becoming a concert pianist to care for his sick wife and to raise his daughters alone. He sacrificed everything he could have been for love. And now, decades later, his hands worn from years of hard work, he still plays. Late at night, when he thinks no one is listening, he sits at this piano and creates music that has more soul than anything I've ever produced in my entire career. The hall was completely silent now. Victoria could see Thomas shaking his head slightly, embarrassed, but she continued. "When I first met Thomas, I mocked him. I humiliated him in front of my students. I told him he had no right to touch this piano because he wasn't good enough, skilled enough, trained enough. I was cruel because I thought I was better than him. I thought my technical ability and my success made me superior." She felt tears prickling at her eyes but didn't try to hide them. "I was wrong. Thomas understands something about music that I'm only beginning to learn. That it's not about perfection. It's about truth. It's about expressing what words cannot. It's about touching people's hearts with your own. Victoria gestured toward Thomas. Sir, would you please join me on stage? Thomas looked horrified. He shook his head, but the audience had already begun to applaud. The people sitting near him encouraged him gently. Finally, slowly, he stood and made his way to the stage, his face flushed with embarrassment. When he reached her, Victoria took his hand. Up close, she could see tears in his eyes. I can't, he whispered. My hands. They don't work like they used to. Everyone will hear the mistakes. That's exactly the point, Victoria whispered back. Let them hear the mistakes. Let them hear what's underneath the mistakes. She led him to the piano bench and gestured for him to sit. The audience waited in hushed anticipation. Thomas sat down slowly, staring at the keys like they were both familiar and foreign at the same time. Play anything you want, Victoria said softly, stepping back to give him space. Just be honest. Thomas sat there for a long moment, his weathered hands hovering over the keys. Then he began to play. He chose Brahms' Intermezzo in a major, a piece that was relatively simple compared to the virtuoso works on Victoria's planned program, but achingly beautiful in its simplicity. His playing was imperfect from the first note. His fingers stumbled occasionally. His timing wavered. His technique showed the limitations of age and arthritis. But none of that mattered. What came from that piano was pure emotion. Every note carried the weight of a life fully lived. The joy of early love, the pain of loss, the pride of watching children grow, the peace of accepting what was and what could never be. Thomas played like a man with nothing to prove and everything to express. Victoria watched from the side of the stage as tears streamed down her face. She wasn't alone. Throughout the audience, she could see people openly crying. Critics who'd come to evaluate technical mastery found themselves unable to write. Two moved to maintain their professional distance. Students who'd laughed at Thomas in the hallways now understood what they'd been too ignorant to see. The piece was short, just a few minutes long. But when Thomas played the final chord and let it fade into silence, no one moved. The silence stretched out, sacred and complete. Then someone in the back row stood up and began to applaud. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, applause thundering through the space like a storm. Thomas sat at the piano, overwhelmed, his shoulders shaking as he cried. Victoria walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, Thank you. Thank you for showing me what music really is. When the applause finally died down, Thomas stood and walked off stage, still crying, still shaking. The audience didn't want to let him go, but he disappeared into the wings, needing privacy for his emotions. Victoria returned to the piano alone. She had her own performance to give now, but she was a different pianist than she'd been when she walked onto that stage. She played the program she'd originally chosen, but she played it differently. She let herself be vulnerable. She thought about her father and her loneliness and her journey to this moment. She made mistakes, small ones that a few weeks ago would have horrified her, but she didn't care. She wasn't playing to be perfect anymore. She was playing to be honest. The response at the end of her performance was enthusiastic, but Victoria knew it wasn't about her technique. It was about what had happened before, about Thomas and the lesson he'd taught everyone in that hall about what really matters in music and in life. After the concert, Victoria found Thomas in the small room where they'd practiced together. He was still in his suit, still looking overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I didn't ask for that, he said softly. That wasn't necessary. Yes, it was, Victoria said firmly. You changed my life, Thomas. You showed me that everything I'd been chasing was hollow. The least I could do was make sure people knew who you really are. I'm just a janitor who likes to play piano, Thomas said, but he was smiling slightly. No, Victoria said. You're a musician who happens to work as a janitor, and you're one of the greatest teachers I've ever had. In the weeks that followed, Victoria's life changed in ways she never expected. She established a scholarship fund in Thomas's name for talented students facing financial hardship. She started teaching free community music classes on weekends, working with students who couldn't afford private lessons. She began choosing her performance programs based on what she wanted to express, rather than what would impress critics. Her reviews became more mixed. Some critics complained that her playing had lost its edge, that she was making uncharacteristic mistakes, but others noted a new depth in her interpretations, an emotional honesty that had been absent before. And her audiences responded more powerfully than ever, leaving concerts moved rather than just impressed. Thomas continued working as a janitor at the conservatory, but something had changed for him too. Students greeted him respectfully now, often stopping to ask his advice about pieces they were struggling with. He was shy about it at first, but gradually he began to share his insights, and those who listened found their own playing transformed. One evening, several months after the concert, Victoria found Thomas in the concert hall late at night, playing as he always did. But this time, instead of hiding and listening through the door, she walked in openly and sat in the front row. Thomas saw her but didn't stop playing, and Victoria sat there listening, learning, understanding that this was what music was meant to be, not a competition, not a performance. Just one human soul speaking to another through the universal language of melody and harmony. When he finished, she applauded softly. "Thank you," she said. "For everything," Thomas smiled. "Thank you for listening." And in that moment, Victoria understood that she'd finally become the musician she was always meant to be. Not because she'd perfected her technique or won more acclaim, but because she'd learned to let her humanity show through her playing. She'd learned that the greatest gift a musician can give isn't perfection, it's truth.